Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the April 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Black Feminism by the Brixton Black Women's Group. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So, this is a pamphlet called Black Feminism. It was first published in Speak Out, issue number 4, and it was published by the Brixton Black Women's Group. I believe that I got this pamphlet off of the website of a UK Marxist-Leninist organization called Red Fight Back. I'm not really familiar with this organization except what I've seen through their website. I was first referred to it by a viewer who suggested an article on autism and capitalism, which was featured on their website, and then from there I started kind of poking around and seeing what the organization was about. I read a few of their policy papers. They seem pretty good, but this is the first time I've heard of them. If anybody has any experience with them, please leave that in the comments. I'd be very interested to hear more. Anyway, let's get into the audiobook. Feminism is the theory underlying the struggle against the systematic oppression of women based on sex. When we speak of the systematic oppression of women, we refer to the many factors which contribute to the oppression of women and maintain and reproduce our subordinate position. These can broadly be divided into the following categories: ideological, cultural, economic, and political. Ideological cultural oppression. Ideology is a system of values and beliefs. Within each society is a dominant ideology which is linked to the economic and political organization of that particular society. It acts by molding people's consciousness so as to reproduce that particular way of life. In a highly oppressive system, such as the capitalist system in which we live, the dominant ideology attempts to make people accept exploitation, and it is successful insofar as it can make the oppressive power relations seem, quote, natural. People, on the other hand, can't be fooled by lies so easily, and there is a continual process of struggle between the dominant ideology and people's resistance to it. Children are born either male or female, determined by biology. Comment, there's also a smaller number of intersex people. Continuing, but women and men are prepared for their different biological and social functions by the process of socialization, which is determined by the dominant ideology. The meaning of woman and man in social terms is what we call gender. The female is conditioned into passivity, submission, and emotional dependence, and the male into self-assertiveness, dominance, and independence in the process of socialization. As women, our consciousness is formed in the conditions of subordination and oppression. Therefore, gender for us means division, inequality, and internalized inferiority. The family, or to be more precise, the ideology surrounding the family, is an important site of women's oppression. Through the family, our roles as men and women are clearly set out. We're taught how to think and be women and men. It is also within this concept of the family that various themes that influence our idea of gender are supposed to be fully expressed. These include such things as romantic love, feminine nurturance, maternalism, and self-sacrifice for women, together with masculine protection and financial support. What this means in practice is that women are primarily responsible for all the tasks connected with housework and childcare. A woman has to service the male, has responsibility for 3 categories of people: children, the sick and disabled, and the elderly, and also has to look after herself. Moreover, performing this role either excludes her from earning a living or negatively affects the terms on which she does so. Both mean that she has to be financially dependent upon a man. Therefore, within the household, there is not only a division of labor, women and men performing different tasks, but also the relationship between the woman and man is such that the woman is systematically dependent upon and unequal to the man. The ideology of the family has far-reaching effects on the position of women in all aspects of life. Economic oppression. In the present-day economic system, based as it is on wage labor, women's severe disadvantage in, if not total exclusion from, the labor market is another important area of our oppression. In earlier periods, during the pre-capitalist feudal times, the whole household as a unit was engaged in productive labor. The development of wage labor, with the production of goods for the market rather than for use, meant that household needs had to be met by incoming wages rather than by internal production. The development of capitalism also brought with it the separation between home and workplace, which created a crisis over the daily care of children, the disabled, and the elderly. This has, as we know, customarily been resolved by giving these responsibilities to women, thus cutting them off from equal participation with men in wage labor. This has been accompanied by the establishment of the privatized domestic area of the home as the particular province of women, and of femininity and maternalism as characteristic of women. Women have become dependent upon the male wage in capitalism, and this is accompanied by an ideology of emotional and psychological dependence. These ideological processes are, however, not in keeping with hard economic reality, which forces most working-class women to take up employment outside the home just to make ends meet. So family ideology doesn't actually keep women within the home, but it does influence the nature of women's participation in employment and ensures that women do a second, unpaid job within the home. The division of labor in present-day capitalism involves a sharp separation between male and female workers. Women are concentrated in particular industries at particular levels and are systematically subjected to poorer pay and working conditions than are men. Despite the equal pay legislation, figures for 1978 show that weekly earnings of women comprise only 64.8% of those of men. Comment: this difference is called the gender pay gap or the gender wage gap, and updated for 2020, it has narrowed somewhat, but women still make about 82% of what men make. This is also not exactly the same across all ethnic and racial demographics, so there's further breakdown needed there. Continuing the text. Low pay is not the only thing that characterizes female wage labor. Job security and wages for part-time work are greatly disadvantaged when compared to full-time work. Yet 41% of all women with jobs in Britain work part-time. Homework on piece rate contracts, which is highly exploitative, is also mainly undertaken by women because of their domestic and child care responsibilities. Comment: so piece rate is when you get paid per piece. So, for example, we were just doing some audiobooks from India by Anuradha Gandhi, and she was talking about how women would in the home do little cigarette type things called beedies, and they would get paid basically per piece rather than per hour or something like that. If you've ever seen the Korean movie Parasite from a few years ago, it won a bunch of awards. At the beginning of the movie, the family is assembling pizza boxes at home. That's also presumably a piece rate type of situation where you get paid like, a penny or 2 cents per box, something like that. All right, continuing. Women workers are more vulnerable to redundancy in times of recession. Since 1974, redundancy among women workers has been 3 times higher than the rate for men. Low representation of women in senior grades and in the higher professions in general reflects the systematic discrimination that women suffer in education and training. In general, within a particular trade, industry, or profession, women occupy jobs which are lower paid, more insecure, and less likely to bring promotion than men. Comment there, an example that I like is in the early 20th century, being a bank teller used to be a, quote, man's job, and people were frequently promoted from teller to higher positions in the bank offices. Then, when women entered the workforce more, the teller position was generally converted into a, quote, woman's job, and there was no longer room for advancement there. It was a dead-end job. So, there's an example. Continuing. Furthermore, women are concentrated in certain low-paid industries. Over 60% of the entire female workforce is concentrated in only 10 occupations: clerical work, shop assistants, typists and secretaries, maids, cleaners, nurses, teachers, canteen assistants, shop managers, and sewing and textile workers. Looking at this list, a clear picture emerges. Most of these jobs can be broadly described as service work, the, quote, caring professions, and socialized forms of domestic service. In other words, the distribution of women in the employed workforce bears a striking resemblance to the division of labor in the family. Division of labor, not only between men and women, but also with regard to children and old people, probably predates capitalism and is not necessarily divisive if the various tasks hold equal status. However, capitalism not only caused the takeover and strengthening of the differentiation of tasks, but divided the workforce itself into wage earners and those dependent upon the wage of others. Capitalism did not create domestic labor, but it did create a set of social relations in which pre-existing sexual divisions were not only reproduced, but solidified within the wage labor system. It can be seen how family relations and the ideology of domestic responsibility play a part in determining the position of women as wage laborers. As outlined earlier, responsibility for childcare forces women to be involved in the highly exploitative areas of part-time work and home. Women are channeled into categories of work such as servicing and caring, which have been established as predominantly, quote, feminine. Also, the construction of a family form in which the male head of the household is supposedly responsible for the financial support of a dependent wife and children, has acted against demands for equal pay and an equal right to work for women. The fact that women happen to be the sole breadwinners in many cases, especially within the black community, still doesn't allow them to escape all the restrictions that operate within the area of women's employment. The ideology of the family also extends to family structures other than the nuclear type. For example, even in the extended family, it's the women who shoulder the responsibility for childcare and domestic work, and so get excluded from equal participation with men in wage labor. The state and women's oppression. The state plays an important role in legitimizing the various dimensions of women's oppression in this society. It actively maintains the household system, where women and children are supposedly dependent upon a male breadwinner's, quote, family wage. Provisions such as the married man's tax allowance and arrangements for national insurance payments are reflections of a woman's financial dependence upon a man within marriage. This same principle, extended to cohabitating couples, results in the disgusting practice of Social Security officials attempting to ascertain a woman's sexual relations with men with a view to depriving her of the right to benefits. Thus, the state very firmly upholds the principle of woman's dependence, in spite of the fact that the number of households fitting the stereotype of the male breadwinner / full-time dependent housewife is, at any given time, very small. In the area of employment, the state regulates terms and conditions of employment in order to reinforce women's subordination, e.g. banning of women from certain work, such as mining, withholding maternity benefits from unmarried women. State provision and regulation of education clearly plays an important part in structuring the different opportunities open to women and men. The state also creates conditions within which racism and sexism are reinforced and legitimized. For example, the Nationality Act, virginity tests, and the administration of the contraceptive drug Depo-Provera are all measures that are particularly oppressive to black women. Another clear example is the recent change in the immigration law which prevents black women from bringing to Britain husbands who are foreign nationals. What this means is that if you are a black woman, even full British citizenship does not give you the same privileges as those of either men merely settled here, who can bring their wives to settle, or EEC women, who, even without British citizenship, can, under the Treaty of Rome, bring their husbands to settle in Britain. This law effectively makes us second-class citizens, and constitutes yet another blatant breach of the European Convention on Human Rights, which denounces discrimination based on sex or race. Britain has been taken to the European Court of Human Rights on this issue, and the initial proceedings have found that Britain has a case to answer. Sexual harassment. In keeping with the state's oppression and subjugation of women, individual men, fathers, brothers, husbands, sons, comrades, friends, and strangers, continue to exploit and humiliate women. In the family, where women are financially dependent on their men, we are treated as their property. As property, men feel that they can use and abuse women verbally and physically with impunity. We are frequently beaten, psychologically pressured, and physically forced into having sex, and then often left to support the offspring of such encounters. Comment: in the United States, in recent years, there have been legislative pushes by the far right to basically reduce rights in this area, and not a good situation. Continuing. On the streets, we are stared at, leered at, manhandled, and raped at knife point. Women, therefore, live a daily life of fear of violence from men, both inside and outside the home. Our instilled fear of male violence then drives us to seek protection from other men, e.g. the police, giving them more power to control us. This control operates on two levels. First, on an individual basis, whereby women are confronted with individual policemen and are subjected to hostility, thinly disguised disbelief and mistrust, and an overall lack of support. One explicit example of this is police reluctance to intervene in cases of even the most brutal marital violence, respecting the privacy of, quote, the family, and upholding the idea that women are the property of men. In rape cases, the police are well known for subjecting the victim to an offensive and degrading inquisition in which her own sexual history is on trial. Individual male violence becomes male social power and is legitimized by the state. This legitimized male social power and sexual aggression is used as a tool to control and intimidate women who dare to fight back. Thus, the law itself reinforces fundamental assumptions about gender division, and it is only very recently that women have been recognized as legal subjects within their own right. The second aspect of this control has to do with the fact that the police force is an arm of the state. As such, it is another tool by which all black people are terrorized and oppressed. As black women, we are faced with the twin oppressions of implicitly condoned male violence because we are women, and explicit violence by the state because we are black. The images that men have of our bodies are thrust upon us. We are evaluated as sex symbols. Pornography and all types of advertising perpetuate sexist stereotypes of how we should look and behave. This is, in turn, reinforced by the mass media through films, television, newspapers, and magazines. Based on the notion that women are the property of men, many women are further exploited through prostitution as a commodity to be bought and sold at will, the male pimp always hovering in the background to collect his supposed due. Sexual harassment, violence, and exploitation of women transcend class and race boundaries. Black and white men, regardless of their class position, align with each other on the basis of shared sexism. Black men who are victimized by racism in the same way as black women act as sexist oppressors of black women. This points to an underlying failure on their part to understand that although sexism does transcend class barriers, it only acts in the interest of one class, the rulers. They fall for the myth of white society which says that all black women are sexually loose and treat us as such. They devalue our efforts to create a better life for ourselves, from which, as black people, we would all benefit. As black women, we are also blamed by the state for being in collusion with the black man to perpetuate our own oppression. Although this is not the case, we can appreciate what it means to be in a racist society, where a black woman may think twice before she calls the police for violence done to her by a black man. However, as black women, our struggle is not about blaming the victim, but is a struggle against the system which has allowed men to see and treat us as mindless objects because of the fact that we are women. Black feminism and the black struggle. To be feminist, therefore, necessitates an understanding of these forces which are brought to bear to oppress us in many subtle and not always apparent ways. To be black and feminist adds a very different dimension to feminism, and involves our coming to terms with the specific implications of such a position. One important consideration concerns the issue of black feminism as a cause of division within the black community. There is a strongly held opinion that black feminism is an assault on the black family, and thus the black community, and which further states that black women have always been sexually liberated. This argument has its foundations in slavery and is based on the so-called easy life of those black women who were forced to service their white masters sexually. Their condition has historically been projected as being closer to that of white women than black men. But the truth is that black women were the most victimized by this situation. We were raped, abused, and beaten by the white masters, and even by some male slaves who imitated them. We were bred like cattle. Mates were chosen, husbands and children taken away at the slave master's command. Black women were assumed to be the sexual property of the owner, his friends, visitors, and relatives. Is this what they would have us call sexual liberation? The myth of matriarchy, with its image of the all-powerful black woman, has persistently plagued the black community and forms the basis for another argument against black feminism. The reasoning behind it contends that there is no need for black women to be feminists because the black woman has always wielded power in black society. Nothing could be further from the truth. Historically, the racism of the state has denied black people their right to employment, while the interaction of racism and sexism has facilitated the entry of black women into specific jobs only. This often means that the black woman is forced to assume responsibility as the breadwinner. However, the work she does is usually menial, with long hours and low pay, at the end of which she still has to care for her own family's needs. The effect of this is to create a twofold situation, calculated to produce hostilities within and thus undermine the black community, and at the same time provide a source of cheap labor for the state. The black man, the argument goes, suffered because his position was demeaned in the eyes of the community. He was made to feel less of a man. But it is the black woman who suffered most from the matriarchal myth, for not only was her labor exploited, but she had, and still has, to bear the accusations and fight against the charge that she emasculates the black man as a result of this situation. To make matters worse, some black men have seized upon this myth to blame all of their oppression on the supposedly domineering black woman. We have always fought against this outrage, however, and will continue to strike out against the application of these insidious stereotypical labels to us. Furthermore, in waging the struggle, it is crucial for us to remember that the only real winners in the whole matriarchal myth and mess are the ruling classes, the state and its forces. The sooner we get rid of this issue as a bone of contention between black men and black women, the better able we'll be to concentrate our efforts against our common oppressor. A further argument against black feminism says that for black women to speak out against sexist oppression causes division within the black community because it takes time and energy away from the black struggle. We are told that the black woman should be squarely in her man's corner, but behind him. During the civil rights movement, a time when the talents and abilities of black men and women should have been jointly recognized in the struggle for black liberation, along came Stokely Carmichael, declaring that the position of women in the movement should be prone. Later, Eldridge Cleaver, a prominent member of the Black Panther Party, said that black women had pussy power. We were expected to contribute to the movement, but only in the way that the black man said that we could. So black women were left in a kind of limbo, damned if we did and damned if we didn't. Our roles for the revolution were to be as coffee makers, cooks, fundraisers, and of course, willing sexual partners, while the men conducted the important business of the struggle. We were not expected to open our mouths about the oppression we suffered as women at the hands of black men, who saw women's liberation, if they thought about it at all, strictly in terms of a minor side issue, a white girl's problem. What they failed to recognize, however, was that the status of black women places us at the intersection of all forms of subjugation in society: racial oppression, sexual oppression, and economic exploitation. This means that we are a natural part of many different struggles, both as black people and as women. This brings us to another issue which we as black women must deal with, the question of autonomy. We must begin by distinguishing autonomy from separatism, as there is some confusion surrounding the two terms. An autonomous movement creates a favorable climate for understanding and evaluating the intricacies involved with the question of the liberation of a particular group, which in turn makes it possible to expand the whole political struggle. The black women's movement in Britain should, like those women who either belong to a women's movement or the arm of a party in third world countries, form part of the total struggle for liberation. This is quite different from women who wish to create change for women in isolation from men. We see this evaluation of the changing position of women in post-revolutionary societies being grappled with by the women in these societies, with one striking example being Cuban women. Black people throughout history have formed autonomous organizations in the belief that it is those who are oppressed who are the best equipped to liberate themselves. No one else can do it for them. Given the nature of our oppression as black people and as women, this can be no less true for black women. Having arrived at autonomy as a necessary option for black women raises the point of exactly what form it should take. There are two major and opposing views in the women's movement currently. Radical feminism contends that the oppression of women is the major and primary oppression in all societies. Patriarchy is identified as a universal mode of power relationship and domination. Male domination and female subjugation, they argue, are achieved through, among other things, their construction of sexuality, masculine-feminine role models, and the socialization of children. Within this perspective, men are seen as dominant by training and use force to maintain control of the economy, the state, and a monopoly on sexual violence. Radical feminists identify patriarchy as being all-pervasive, penetrating class divisions and different societies, and as crossing cultures and historical periods. The logical outcome of identifying men as the sole enemy leads to total separation as the only solution. The other viewpoint is socialist feminism, which we in the Brixton Black Women's Group hold. To us, it is clear that while male domination goes back a long way, women's oppression today is inextricably linked with the whole system of class oppression, whereby a small group of the rich and powerful ruling class control, exploit, and severely oppress the vast majority of the people, both men and women. To understand our situation properly, we have to understand the roots of women's oppression, both historically and cross-culturally. To achieve this, it is necessary to examine and analyze the interrelations and connections between the various factors which form the basis of women's subjugation, as discussed earlier. These areas have to be examined not in isolation, but in relation to the whole oppressive capitalist system. Likewise, the struggle for women's liberation has to be part of the concrete struggle against class oppression, for no form of liberation will be possible without the overthrow of the capitalist system. In adopting this position, as black women, we are strongly influenced by the knowledge that our countries of origin, the so-called Third World, having been actively underdeveloped by colonialism, a part of capitalism, are even now being raped and pillaged under the stranglehold of imperialism, yet another, and to us very relevant, aspect of capitalism. Thus, a few industrialized countries grow more and more wealthy and powerful at our expense, while our people die of starvation, and our own countries fall ever deeper into dependence and poverty. It is therefore impossible for us to consider the oppression of women separately from the international oppression by imperialism of our countries of origin and our experience, even here in Britain, of racism, which molds the life of our whole community. Yet we are also aware that overthrowing the whole capitalist and imperialist system does not automatically bring about an end to women's oppression. It is a specific and complex issue which needs to be addressed and dealt with directly if it is to be dealt with effectively. Some would argue that, given the immense task ahead of black people in liberating ourselves as a people, we should concentrate on that task first, before worrying about women's liberation. But this ignores the fact that as long as women are oppressed, and this oppression continues to be ignored, we cannot take our rightful place in the overall struggle, which will, as a result, be only half as strong as it should be. Hence, in the context of the wider struggle for black socialist liberation, it is as important to address the issue of women's oppression right from the beginning, as it is for women involved in the struggle for our own liberation, to recognize our role within the wider struggle. It is in this context of an understanding of our oppression based on sex, race, and class, and the recognition of our struggle being part and parcel of the greater black struggle for the liberation of all our people from all forms of oppression, that black feminism is defined for us. That's the end of the audiobook. I have to say, that is a wonderful introduction to the subject. I mean, I read a lot of stuff on this channel, and just that was really concise, and just whoever wrote this really did a good job. So I'm not going to burden this with any more of my own comments, but I will just open it up to you, the audience. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more. Every donation is encouraging, and they're also materially helpful, so I really appreciate it. The amount of support that I've received on Patreon has enabled me to spend a lot more time making videos, so it has directly resulted in more content going up on the channel. Much appreciated, and thanks to everybody who's been involved in that. Also, thanks to everybody who's engaged with the content by liking, sharing, subscribing, commenting on the videos, even if it's just thanks or good video. All of that interaction helps to boost the channel in the YouTube algorithm, and it makes it more likely that your average working person with questions about society is going to stumble across this content. It gets boosted and just easier for people to find, even people who aren't necessarily actively looking for it. So all of that plays a part, and future audience members, thank you. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next video.